Welcome to the Supported Living Property Podcast with your host, me, Lisa Brown, the place to learn about supported living property investing. Hi, Carolyn. It's great to have you here today. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Oh, it's fab. For people who don't know you, do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about you?
Yes, well, my name's Carolyn Howell. I'm Chief Executive of Solo Housing, and we're a small supported housing provider operating in the eastern region in Norfolk and Suffolk. It's our sort of counties that we operate in. I've been with Solo just over 5 years now as Chief Executive. Prior to that, I worked for Shelter, the National Homelessness charity. So I've learned a lot actually joining Solo. I didn't work in the support housing sector before I joined, so yeah, it's been great. We've got a great little team as well.
And so what kind of work do you do at Solo? You know, when you say it's supported accommodation, who are the people that you're working with mostly there?
So the clue's kind of in the name. So we work with single people. That's always been our focus and will continue to be our focus, partly because single people often struggle to access services. They're not necessarily not able to access sort of statutory services. They don't have the same rights, for example, as families or single parents necessarily. So it's quite challenging for single people. So it just feels right for us to continue to focus on their needs. So we're sort of three things in a way. We're a small housing association, one of the smaller ones. We're a charity, and we're also a company limited by guarantee. So we've got sort of three regulators that we're answerable to. And I think particularly with the social housing sector, certainly the regulation seems to be increasing quite a bit at the moment. So we've got a range of services really. In terms of where we operate in South Norfolk and Broadland, Breckland, Great Yarmouth, and Lowestoft, and then we also operate in Baber and Mid Suffolk, and our head office is actually in Diss, which is conveniently kind of the epicenter of all those areas. Everywhere is sort of an hour away, and sort of in a circle, which has worked quite well for us really. And Diss has got quite good transport links as well, and we've got, some of our projects are based in Diss too. In terms of our services, so we sort of developed services, I would say, to try and meet need. We set out a 5-year business plan 5 years ago, well, just under 5 years ago. It's coming to the end of the plan next financial year. But we didn't put targets in that of, we want to get to 200 bed spaces by X date or whatever. We've tended to focus on what is the need and how do we meet that and work that way. So we find ourselves with about 150 bed spaces of supported accommodation at the moment. So we've grown by about 40% over the last 4 years. So it's been a gradual process really. And we provide supported accommodation for single people. I suppose it's distinct from supported living in that it's our client group have a background in homelessness, substance misuse, mental health, other health issues, care leavers in the criminal justice system, etc. But the idea really of our supported accommodation is it's temporary. So it's around about 18 months to 2 years, and would normally stay with us with a view to sort of getting back on their feet, addressing any issues that they have when they come to us, and then sort of moving on to the next stage of their lives really. So it's not seen as a long-term accommodation, and that's partly because of that's what the need is, and secondly that's a commissioning requirement basically. So we're contracted by both Suffolk County and Norfolk County councils under their sort of adult care services, effectively, to provide that form of accommodation, basically. Well, that's some of the accommodation we provide. We've then sort of evolved that service. So I suppose that's been our core. But then we've evolved the same kind of model, but for particular client groups. So we've developed a project for women in the criminal justice system because there was a need identified, particularly South Norfolk District Council actually approached us originally and said they felt they had a need for women who wanted to return to the district. They may have been in prison. Our local women's prison is in Peterborough, so it's a little way away, but it's not, you know, it's an hour or so away. And they just didn't have any supported accommodation that was suitable. So we've set up a project particularly for women in the criminal justice system. And it's worked really well, actually. I mean, it's got lots of challenges. It took a while to get going because we were setting it up in the COVID lockdown. So it's a small project. We've got 6 beds of accommodation for women. And again,
is that in one property? Is that how that's?
No, it isn't actually. We've got 2 2-bed shares and then 2 single units. Some of the women just really struggle to share, to be honest. So it's good to have some single person units as an option as well, really. I mean, we really would like to expand that project because there's clearly a high need, and, you know, not just in South Norfolk district, in all the districts, really. So we're looking how we can expand that. And I think the MOJ is sort of looking at funding for that type of service as well.
That would be the Ministry of Justice by the MOJ,
sorry,
isn't
yes,
it? No, just making sure. Yeah, absolutely. That we're clear for everybody. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, so, you know, that's been a really interesting project. We've learned quite a lot along the way, I think, about you know, those women are particularly vulnerable. They've had really challenging lives, basically, and do need a lot of support, but they've done brilliantly. Some of them have, you know, well, they've done an amazing job themselves, really. Once they've got into that accommodation, got a support worker who's sort of behind them, really. I mean, one woman has completed a forklift truck driving course, you know, wants to get a job, and, you know, she had to give up alcohol to do that. So that really was a sort of motivation for her to do that. We've had other women who've taken part in a jewelry making course that we ran for them. We got some funding for that, and that was a real sort of confidence boost for them. So they've made lots of items of jewelry which we're now selling to raise some money to run another course for another group of women. So it's all really about, you know, empowering people to kind of recognize their own skills, actually, because they all come to us with skills and they've all done things in their lives. It just so happens that when they join us, you know, they may be facing particular challenges, really. So what else do we do? So we also developed a project for rough sleepers in Breckland District Council area. So Breckland District Council grant fund us for that. They're actually in turn grant funded by the Rough Sleeper Initiative, the government national initiative. And again, a lot of this came out of sort of COVID, really, and everybody in. So in Norfolk, I think the districts were quite successful at getting people in, but keeping them in was quite difficult. You know, people drifted away for various reasons, and there basically wasn't enough supported accommodation for certain groups. So the council approached us to set up a project for rough sleepers. So the rough sleepers that they were working with, again, single people, refer to us. We then accommodate them, and we basically sort of work with them to, again, decide what their next steps are. That might be going into more of a sort of medium-term supported accommodation, or it could be accessing private rented sector accommodation. Again, it's been quite a successful project. You know, people have once they've got into that accommodation, they've got into work, they've got, you know, into sort of more settled life, and then been able to move on, basically. So we're just in the process of expanding that. So we've got 4 beds at the moment in one property, and we're expanding that to 10 beds next month, because there's still really high need. Unfortunately, a lot of rough sleepers in all the districts, really, but Breckland particularly. So those are the kind of projects that we've sort of worked from our baseline of supported accommodation, housing related support, as it's usually referred to by commissioners. And then what can we do to sort of target particular projects and particular need, really, but with the same principles about how we operate.
Amazing. And I love the fact that you're working in the different areas and doing some really innovative stuff in different ways, you know, to meet the needs that people have. Obviously, you're working in quite a rural community. What are the challenges of trying to get hold of accommodation, and what are the challenges delivering the support in that kind of community?
I think, I mean, there's a number of challenges for rural communities. Partly, I think the people that we work with have been quite hidden, actually. They're not people, I don't think the general public are particularly aware of homelessness in rural areas. And I think it's increasing, and we certainly keep banging on about it, but, you know, they are quite hidden, really. So, you know, challenge one is, how does somebody access a service? You know, how do they know where to go to access a service?
Because people are sofa surfing and sleeping in cars, things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Tents, cars, outbuildings, floors, etc. And some of them quite wary of approaching the local authority. You know, they may not have had a great experience in the past, or probably assume they're not going to get any help, to be honest. So, I mean, we have actually got our own sort of homelessness prevention service, which we use to sort of target and sort of reach out to people. So people can approach us directly, or they come via other agencies, basically. So I suppose, sorry, it's a bit rambling, but I think access is a challenge because people don't always know where to go. And it's, you know, I think people who are homeless in the larger towns and cities can almost become a bit of a community in themselves, and they find out where to go because they tell each other, etc. But people who are homeless in rural areas are very isolated. So, you know, trying to find people and reaching out to them is quite important, really. So that's one challenge. I mean, geography, just physical geography is quite interesting. There aren't really any great roads in Norfolk and Suffolk so much. So, you know, just from a service delivery point of view, it's deciding where you're going to base your staff so that geographically they can get to the accommodation that we're providing, or meeting people in the community. And, you know, there's an expectation for frontline workers to have a car, because you just can't get around these counties without your own transport. And, you know, that's quite expensive for people as well. So I think that can be quite a challenge in a rural area, sort of an extra cost as well. And I suppose the thing that's really been hitting us perhaps in the last year is affordability. So, and that's having a double effect, really, because that's increasing homelessness because of people not being able to afford accommodation in rural areas. And then it's having a knock-on effect for us trying to secure accommodation where we secure it from private landlords whose expectations have raised, basically, in terms of what they think financially their return is going to be.
Because the rents have gone up significantly in your area.
Yeah. So, you know, we work with a lot of private landlords, and we've had some long-standing relationships. And we know that they're under financial pressure as well. But I just think the whole house price inflation has just had a knock-on effect, basically, for everybody, really. And, you know, we've noticed that, I mean, South Norfolk district, for example, is now a very popular second home area. it almost feels, because the coastal parts in this part of the world have always been very popular, but it's almost sort of coming inland a bit, because I think, you know, people who would have perhaps wanted a second home, that's become unaffordable in certain parts, and they're kind of moving. It feels like they're moving in our direction, and you know, it's made the prices go up generally. And a lot of people are working from home now as well, aren't they? So, you know, they may benefit from quite good salaries from outside of the county, but, you know, and that gives them more options around what they can spend compared to people who, you know, live and work in the county as well, I suppose. So there's been quite a lot of pressures really on housing costs generally, I think.
Because housing benefit hasn't gone up significantly to match that, has it? I think people don't realise that housing benefit hasn't jumped up to match it. And so if you're, you know, you're claiming housing benefit for the people you're supporting, you're not going to be able to meet those high rents. No,
there's a quite a big gap basically. And again, I think for single people, I mean, there's not really a lot of single accommodation around really, particularly in rural areas. It's not like you've got blocks of flats sort of dotted around everywhere, 1-bed flats, etc. A lot of it is family accommodation, bigger houses. All the houses that are being built seem to be 3-4 bed properties basically. So there's just not enough single unit accommodation for people as well in rural areas, and increasingly in the social housing sector as well. I mean, that's one of our key challenges really, because that has a knock-on effect for those in our supported housing who finished their support plan. They may have moved into work, they're ready to move on, and then the move on options, you know, are quite challenging for them because there's not much on the sort of social housing register to apply for. So they're competing with a lot of different people, and the private sector is very expensive for them, unfortunately. So
that must have a big issue for you as a service delivery point of view, because you end up with people kind of stuck in your accommodation, I guess, if they can't move on.
Yeah, which, you know, is not it's not what we're trying to achieve. It's blocking that bed for somebody who does have support needs. So, you know, it has a knock-on effect really.
Yeah, no, that must be a really big challenge. What do you think some of the solutions are? What do you think needs to change, or what is changing, or how are you working to come around some of those problems?
Well, from our own point of view, one of the things we have got an opportunity, I suppose, because in DIS we have we call it a hostel, but it's more like a shared, well, it's a shared house really. It's a 7-bed and then a 6-bed unit next door on the same site, which we own. So we've got a little plot of land behind there, which we've been working on plans to get planning permission to develop, so that we've actually, you know, what we'd like to achieve is our own 1-bed move on flats for some of the people in our supported accommodation, or they might be in other supported accommodation in the area basically. So, you know, that's okay. We can only get 9 flats probably on that site, but, you know, that would make quite a difference actually, in terms of unlocking some more of that potential. So that, you know, on a very small scale, that's something that we're trying to do. In terms of securing accommodation for a project, so we continue to work with private landlords, but increasingly we're actually working with other larger social housing providers. So the Women's Accommodation Service that I mentioned earlier, we've worked with Saffron Housing Trust, who've basically leased us units of accommodation that they've actually found quite hard to let from a sort of general needs point of view for various reasons. But they work perfectly well for the supported housing that we want to provide. So that's been a good solution. That's been a really positive partnership piece of work. And similarly for the Off the Street project with Rough Sleepers, we're working with Flagship Housing, who are leasing us a couple of properties as well. So that's one solution. Obviously that's sort of they have to be mindful that they can't take out a lot of stock out of the social housing stock, because then that sort of defeats the purpose. But I think particularly with some of the ones they've leased us, they're 2-3 bed properties, which for whatever reason they're struggling to let to a family, but actually as a shared house for 3 single people work very well. So, you know, it's just about maximizing the stock that's available, really. What else are we doing? I mean, we do continue to work with private landlords, and we do get private landlords that are approaching us. And, you know, I would say, you know, talk to us, because we're actually a really good organization to work with. Obviously, I'm very biased, but, you know, we've got a lot of experience with working with private landlords, and we've basically got a property service that we can provide them. We've got our own in-house property specialist team in terms of property management, and we've got our own building surveyor, so they can provide lots of technical advice around compliance and building regulations for a landlord. So, you know, we can work with landlords to give them a good package, really, that keeps them safe, you know, ensures that their properties are fully compliant. Basically, they will lease property to us for between 3 and 5 years generally. We'll fix the rent. We try and fix the rent at below what they would get on the open market. But basically that's because they're going to get that rent 52 weeks of the year, regardless of whether it's full or not, because, you know, we're going to cover that, and we manage that property, we let it, we do everything pretty much for them, really. And if it's something that the landlord needs to do, then we advise them, and they either decide whether they want to do that piece of work themselves, or we can facilitate that as well. So, you know, in our own mind, you know, it's a good property management service without having to pay an estate agent's fees, etc. So but, you know, we want to have an open conversation with investors and landlords about what the expectation is, really. I mean, we're a social landlord. There's lots of regulations that we need to meet, increasingly so, new regulations coming in. But then equally, there's new regulations going to come in for private landlords as well. And I suppose it's partly about how we can work with landlords to kind of educate them to a certain extent about the pros and cons of being a landlord to a certain extent, and what the risks are, and what you need to think about, and what the real costs are as well, because, you know, it's quite challenging. And I suppose, you know, we would say if an investor is looking at a property they want to purchase that they may want to let to us, and we've got a couple that are doing that at the moment, just factoring in those future compliance costs into their business model really is going to be really important.
Absolutely. And like you say, by the time you've taken into account some voids, you know, even if it's just for a few weeks, that pretty quickly eats into your profits on a standard buy to let. So yeah, absolutely. And we find, you know, our landlords excuse me, you know, they'll get permission from their mortgage lender as well. So that's all covered, and, you know, hopefully the mortgage lender will see that that's quite a good arrangement as well, really. I mean, that's definitely a challenge for property investors, is lending. I know I bang on about it all the time, so you know, listeners to the podcast will be very familiar with that, but that is a real challenge for property investors. But it's something we're working on to hopefully change that a little bit.
Absolutely. And I mean, the funding packages for social housing is a challenge as well. You know, we've sort of, hopefully we'll get our planning permission through. We've had our sort of initial costings for developing these flats. We've got a rough idea of how much Homes England might put into that scheme, but there's still quite a gap actually to fill. And, you know, that is one of the challenges. I think more needs to be thought about how organisations like us can pull together a funding package to provide those solutions, because, you know, we're a small organisation. If we did the development, we would be working in partnership with Orwell Housing, who've got their own development team, so we'd be using their expertise. But it would be nice to think that small organisations like us could develop, you know, small schemes that meet a particular need. And it doesn't always have to be the larger housing associations.
Well, you're on the ground, you know what the need is in your community, and you understand your community really well. So surely you should be delivering that solution for them. You know, that makes so much sense,
that's our thinking really, and it helps for us to grow with an asset base as well. It gives us a longer term asset basically. So although short term, you know, it can look a bit challenging to stack up, but you have to sort of continue to add to your asset base really.
And that's certainly something the regulator's looking at, isn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of you guys. So yeah, absolutely. Carolyn, thank you. That's been really, really helpful. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us today. Is there anything else that you wanted to add in? Anything else about collaborative working or anything else you wanted to say?
I suppose what else? What's going on? I suppose one of our solutions that we've worked in partnership with is with a charity called the Benjamin Foundation, and they're a supported accommodation provider, but they work with young people, sort of the cohort between 18s and 30s kind of age range. They approached us around a sort of partnership approach to delivering a service. There was a particular project that they'd taken on in Great Yarmouth, which was at risk of failing basically, because they needed a housing association in the chain to be the landlord for that particular supported accommodation provision. It's how the exempt accommodation benefit payment work basically. The local authority housing benefit department needs that assurance that you've got a housing association in the chain for them to be able to sort of agree the exempt rents for supported accommodation. So, you know, that's worked quite well. We've taken that on. We basically take on the properties. So we sort of take on that landlord function of compliance and standards, etc. And then the Benjamin Foundation act as the support provider. So that's sort of been a great sort of way of two organisations working together to achieve a common objective really. And we're looking to grow that. Well, we are growing that sort of provision basically in other parts and moving into Suffolk as well. So, you know, I think it's important, you know, we're not big organisations. We can't work in silo. You know, we like to work together to come up with solutions really. So that's worked quite well.
Fantastic. And I think, you know, like you say, that collaborative working is a really positive way forward, isn't it, to help everybody? So
yeah, definitely we're all busy, so it's good to kind of share what we've got really.
Absolutely. Carolyn, thank you very much. We'll pop your contact details in the show notes so people can get hold of you if they want to, and that's great. Thanks for sharing your time today. Bye bye.
Thanks very much. Thank you.